Claude, OpenAI, and Gemini are a lot more mature in 2006. In this video, I want to help you decide which one you should be using for your next project. I'll be looking at Claude 4.5, GPT 5.2, and Gemini 3 Professional because each one comes with different tools and extensions that make it unique. I want to specifically delve into what they're like when you're using them inside of a coding IDE, a terminal CLI, and how their performance to price goes. Let's begin. Firstly, let's have a look at the pricing for each model because this is going to play a significant factor when deciding which model you'll be using for projects. The website artificialanalysis.ai is one of the best websites to compare the price of different models as well as how they perform against different indexes like Humanity's Last Exam. From a quick glance, it might look like Claude's models are some of the most expensive, followed by GPT 5.2 and then Gemini 3 Pro. However, this isn't very specific. Let's compare the million token input and output amounts. Gemini comes in at $2 for input and $12 per output. Claude comes in at $5 and $25, and OpenAI comes in at $1.75 and $14 respectively. Since the majority of what we're doing is outputs, Gemini does come in as the cheapest, while Claude is the most expensive. But the reality is a little bit different when it comes to things like MCP or one-shot, or even just looking through your directory and trying to implement features through agents. Let's have a look at some of those examples now. I'll start the test with a one-shot, where I'm going to get all three models to create a similar design for a hexagon with a bouncing ball in the middle. I'll start with Claude 4.5. Here, I'm going to get it to create this in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and here's the output. There are some buttons here to modify it, so let's move on and test this same prompt out, but this time using OpenAI's GPT 5.2. OpenAI's model took a little bit longer, but only like 10 seconds, since this is a pretty simple coding task. It came up with this hexagon just here, with a few parameters on the top left which I can modify, such as the friction, gravity, and even the rotation of the hexagon. For these one-shots, I wouldn't think too deeply because you can rerun them multiple times and sometimes get different outputs. So with that said, let's move on to the Gemini 3 model and see how it performs at the same task. Here in Cursor, I'm going to swap to Gemini 3 Pro and give it a few seconds to run through. Now, it actually came up with the simplest design of all three tests, with a very simple design for a hexagon with this bouncing ball. I couldn't modify anything, but the physics did feel a little bit more realistic compared to the other two. I'll show you one more one-shot, this time for a web design. We'll start off with Claude 4.5. It's going to create a design for Cleon's Adventure, an RPG game with a landing page. Here are the colors and look and feel of that page. I'd say that Claude did a pretty good job at creating the design for this with hover effects and good use of color contrast as well as sections for the page. Now let's try this one shot for a landing page web design using GPT 5.2. Just like Claude 4.5, it did a pretty good job at creating the overall color, structure, and design. It was definitely a lot more text heavy than Claude, but in a good way, since a lot of this text is relevant to the idea of what this game or landing page should be. So overall, I'd rate it pretty highly. In terms of Gemini 3 Pro, it's probably the design that I liked the least because it seemed a lot more simplistic. The colors didn't really match and the pages themselves felt very shallow and unfinished. So I would say that out of all of these, Claude definitely was the winner. This time, we'll test out how plan mode works for all three models. I've got a feature request here for one of the apps I'm building, and I'm going to get Claude 4.5 to implement a plan to implement this feature. Then I'll test out the same with Gemini and OpenAI's GPT 5.2 and see how each one compares at planning out this task. Claude's model actually asks you a few questions in plan mode, allowing you to figure out exactly how you want to implement this feature if you haven't given it enough context. I really like this, and I'm wondering if the other models will do this too. Claude's plan itself considers the overview, the current state of the project, how to implement it along with examples of code, a UI example of the structure, as well as how the button should behave, and it even creates a step-by-step guide of what it's going to do. So I'd have to say that Claude's done a pretty good job here in planning mode. Now to test out the plan mode in Gemini 3 Pro. And here are the results. Unfortunately, Gemini 3 Pro has actually gone ahead and made file changes. It's deleted some spacing from one of my files, which doesn't really make much of a difference. But here in my projects files, it started to actually implement code which I didn't ask for. It has created a plan which is a lot more shallow in comparison to Claude, but overall, this is not the intended behavior I want inside of a plan mode inside of Cursor. I do know that Cursor is optimized to work with Claude, but if you're going to be using Gemini 3 Pro for plan mode, it's not something I would recommend. Now, one final test here with GPT 5.2 to see how it goes in plan mode inside of Cursor. GPT 5.2 just finished, and it did ask me two relevant questions, which is how to save the content and whether I meant discard or discord, because I actually had a typo in my prompt. So these are two good things. It's also created a much more interesting plan here with a little bit of a diagram of even how the data flow should be. So overall, I'm really impressed with how GPT 5.2 handled this request, and it hasn't implemented anything either. It's just created this nice plan for me to overview. So overall, I would even say that this is the best version of plan mode I've seen in a while. Now let's take a look at tool use, specifically MCP servers, since they're a part of the day-to-day use of AI agents these days. So I want to compare all the models against how they use a specific MCP server. For our example, I'll be using Tiger Data. It's a Postgres-based data platform designed for massive amounts of data to be streamed, as well as real-time analytics at scale. They're also today's sponsor, and they're entirely free to use if you're just signing up without having to sign up with a credit card. What makes them special is that their Postgres data system directly connects to AI assistants through MCP, so your models can query data safely without a bunch of custom code or integration. Let's test them out right now. For the first example, I'll get Claude to access Tiger Data and create a database on its platform based on this feature request. It goes through and does the tool calls pretty well without any issues, as well as create the content as you can see up here. Now let's use GPT 5.2 to do these MCP tool calls. Now there's a slight difference with how it's doing these tool calls. It still does them actively and quite well, but it actually does one step further, doing a tool call for all the projects in the directory and creates a brand new project for this specific project itself, which I actually kind of like because it doesn't actually know that I'm comparing all the tool calls between AI models, and it actually is treating this like a brand new project. Now for the final test, let's see how Gemini goes when it does the same sort of MCP calls. So let me just select it over here and click to run that. It's just finished running, and it's actually gone through and created a brand new service along with a database as well as the table on that database. You can see it over here next to Axel Design. If we head to Explorer, we can actually see this collection here, and this has the correct type of attributes I would expect in the schema. I have to say that all three models did a pretty similar job when it came to tool calling. I know that in previous years, I've had issues with tool calling, and Claude seemed to always do it correctly, where some of the other models were hit or miss. Now in 2026, all of them seem to recognize that tool calling is becoming a day-to-day norm, and they're all running the same. I want to take a look at long-running tasks using all three models, because some tasks that we request can be taking up to 10, 20, or even 30 minutes to complete. Luckily for me, there's this dev.to article here that I'll link in my description, which actually compared this across some different types of tasks, one of which was creating an analytics dashboard. Let's have a look at how each one of these models performed. To start off with, GPT 5.2 took around 26 minutes to create this dashboard using about $1.10, and it used up around 236,000 tokens. It did a pretty good job, but it was extremely slow, while still being quite powerful. Claude, which was using Opus 4.5, actually cost a lot more. It cost $1.78. It was much faster, taking only about 8 minutes. It also did a really great job at this task. Finally, Gemini 3 Pro was actually the shortest in terms of duration. It only took 5 minutes. It also meant that the cost was extremely low due to the low usage of the tokens, and it also did a very similar job to the other two models, making it a pretty good option in terms of cost to output. Okay, I want to take a step back and talk about the models that I personally use on a daily basis, since I'm doing a lot of coding on the front end and back end. Predominantly, I'm jumping into Cursor, and I'm starting off in plan mode whenever I'm building out a feature or a function inside of one of my apps. Because Claude actually produces the best results in plan mode, this is the model that I usually go to. Since I'm already using Claude for plan mode, it's quite easy for me to then go straight into active mode and continue using Claude. Now, sometimes the results I get aren't perfect, and this is where I might switch the models up to something like Gemini or GPT in order to just see what kind of outputs they produce for that same sort of a plan. But at the end of the day, Claude is my go-to, and it's what I would recommend if you're trying to build out a project. Additionally, there's always new tools from Anthropic, like Claude Code, which performs really well in terms of the terminal, and they've just released Claude Cowork, which is something I want to check out next. Finally, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, because they make videos like this happen. If you haven't checked out Tiger Data, it's a Postgres database built for coding and AI agents, and it's got a steady stream of new tools, making agent-driven development pretty easy. If you want to learn more about them, check out the link in the description below.